Hello, welcome to this first episode of the Ukraine Military History Podcast, which goes into the current situation in this war with our lead analyst writing the first draft of history on this podcast, Rob Lee, and his Ukrainian analytical colleague, Dmytro Putiata. These guys are the ones that go to the front line, have deep access, I think more than anyone in the community, to the front lines in Ukraine. And Rob is a worldwide expert on this field, lives in Ukraine with me here, and obviously Dima lives here, just left active service, is continuing to serve as an analyst supporting the war effort here. So their conversation goes over why is, this is part one of a two-part conversation. We split due to length of recording they made in the middle of May 2026 about the current situation on the front line. So if you're listening to this later, keep in mind this is recorded around May of 2026. So Rob and Dima talk about why is 2026 much better picture than last year. What are the major reforms that the Ukrainian military has made related to the core structure, countering Russian infiltration. They talk about the drone line concept and how Ukraine has implemented this to counter Russian infiltration tactics and stabilize the line. Finally, they also talk about the growing effectiveness of Ukraine's deep and middle strike campaigns on Russian logistics, especially in the southern part of Ukraine, but also deeper and deeper inside of Russia. So this is the first in a two-part conversation. We're going to continue this in a couple episodes. The second part of this conversation, be watching for that. So in the meantime, enjoy this first draft of history with the two top middle analysts of this war, Rob Lee and Dima, on this episode of the Ukraine Military History Podcast. Before we start this episode, I just wanted to make a quick word to mention our sponsors. I'm going to give you a brief introduction for our sponsors, and then at the end of the show, we'll do a longer discussion about each sponsor and what we're offering so that you can get right into the content. So this podcast is funded by the Borderlands Foundation. The Borderlands Foundation is a foundation that I established to make sure Ukraine's heroes are never forgotten. And we have two main centers that are, in effect, the sponsor for this podcast. The first center is the Ukraine Military History Institute. It's an English-speaking and Ukrainian speaking center, which is, our mission is to translate Ukraine's history from Ukrainian into English for the world to consume and learn from. Ukraine has a lot of allies who've supported it. Almost all of them, the common language of military officers, military historians, and professionals is English. So the Ukraine Military History Institute created and sponsors this. And I'll tell you all about our programs and how you can support the Institute at the end of the episode. The second sponsor for this podcast is the Ukraine Center for Traumatic Stress. This is also part of the Borderlands Foundation. It's a center dedicated to research and raising awareness and helping to bring in to Ukraine cutting-edge therapies, treatments, protocols, and education related to post-traumatic stress disorder. The heroes of Ukraine that are fighting this war, whether they're Ukrainians or foreigners who've come in to fight side by side with Ukrainians, they're writing this history, which creates the stories, which creates a strong future country. And those memories have costs, so we're dedicated to helping advance the research, treatment, and breakthrough that all soldiers, veterans can have dealing with and overcoming post-traumatic stress disorder and mental health that arises from their service. And then finally, our last sponsor is the Borderlands Group. This is a for-profit company that donates the money to fund the Borderlands Foundation and all of our programs. I'm also the founder and president of that organization. And we do military advisory for defense companies working inside Ukraine, and consulting and software development and technical work for both governments and military defense companies. So with that, that's our sponsors. At the end of the podcast, I'm going to tell you a lot more about each sponsor if you're looking for ways that you can contribute to the Borderlands Foundation, our two centers, or if you'd like to work with myself, Rob, and other contributors for this podcast, I'll talk to you about how you can get in touch with us through the Borderlands Group for that.
Hi, I'm Rob Lee. I'm a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and we're working together with Dmytro, both on the Ukraine Military History podcast, as well as the Two Marines Substack, which we set up together. And we're continue working on analyzing the Russian military, analyzing the war, and talking about modern warfare in general. So, Dima, current situation, I mean, a lot to talk about, but how would you assess maybe the current situation in the war?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's even uncomparable to what we had, for example, for the last year. And I don't want to be that much optimistic, but as I said, situation is much better. In a lot of cases, in a lot of areas of the front line is stabilized. Maybe temporary, I understand this, but I think it happens because of different things. The first one maybe we have this army reform in terms of army corps. And the second one, we kind of seems like in most cases managed to find a way how to deal with Russian so-called infiltration. And maybe for the set reason, we also know, at least partly, how to deal with Russian drone attacks, how to deal with their new tactics. And a big also thing is that we're finally conducting the so-called middle strike operations. And I need to say that usually Russians start attacking, like since April till late October. This is their spring, summer offensive campaign. But this is the end of spring, and we saw nothing extraordinary from the Russian side. And this is not about that they plan something bigger. On the contrary, they kind of decrease their appetite in terms of encircling and destroying our forces that they had for years. And right now they did a couple of big regrouping of their forces. They had to react to our counter-offensive operations, especially that one that took part in Oleksandrivka direction near to Gulai. And it definitely changed their plans. They had to send 2 Marine divisions there. And it was like their reserve before that, because they use it in the Dobropillia direction. They kind of need to say that they failed to achieve something after they deployed the Marine group of forces. And they also sent troops from Pokrovsk direction to Ocheraton direction. This is so-called kind of also related to the Dobropillia direction, and took some forces from the Dobropillia direction to Pokrovsk. So I think it will be their next main focus. We still have some problems in Slavyansk area, because the 11th Army Corps unfortunately didn't manage to deal with different types issues. And I want to say that in this case, Russians have managed to advance, not because they, created something new. They're better, anything like that, or they have more drone operators, drones. Unfortunately, they managed to do that because of some kind of inner problems that we have, frankly speaking, since the beginning of the war. Because some army corps are capable of doing that, even if they do not operate with their own brigades, because it usually happens, for example, at Pokrovsk direction. That the 7th Rapid Forces Corps is dealing with maneuver brigades from, motorized brigades, but still they are capable of doing this as it should be, in a good way. So I think a big part of what's going on right now, it's about so-called middle strikes, or strikes on operational deaths, so you can call them whatever you want. And I think that before talking about that, I'm sure that we need to divide these kind of strikes into 2 parts. The first part is let be 25 or 30 kilometers from 25 to 55 to 60, where we usually strike in the trucks, maybe some kind of radar systems, maybe air defense systems. That's one thing. And another thing is a little bit deeper, where we strike in the ammunition depots, fuel depots, HQs, kind of positions, buildings that are occupied by Russians. They live there, drone operators, the reserves. So in general, it creates much better situation for us. And I said it in the beginning, is that we kind of managed to find a solution how to deal with these infiltrations that took part in 2025. Of course, it's mostly will be related right now and tested during summer. Well, you will have a natural cover by tree lines, but I think they won't have this kind of success they had it, for example, last year.
Yeah. So, like, I mean, I think there's a general sense of optimism, I'd say,
Yeah.
in Ukraine, where, the war is still very difficult. No one's under any illusions it's going to end, I think, in the near future. But there's legitimate reasons to think the situation is better today than maybe a year ago. And I think when we explore what happened in 2025, I think we can kind of get into this. But, I think first is it was a very cold winter. It was like the coldest winter in Ukraine in, like, I think, over a decade.
Yep.
Russia was effective at targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. I think they knocked out something like 60% of the gas storage back in like October. And, just speaking about Kyiv, I mean, in my apartment in Kyiv, maybe 12 hours of energy or of power a day, maybe less than that, depends. Like sometimes there are multiple days of no power. And I live in the city center. And so, it wasn't particularly bad for me because my building at least had water and some heat without power. Whereas a lot of buildings in Kyiv, if you lose power, you lose water and heat altogether.
Yeah, especially at the left bank.
Exactly, on the other bank of the river. And then it becomes just, living and surviving becomes very, very difficult. And so this was a very cold winter that was very difficult all winter long. I would say for the last maybe 2 months, electricity has been basically constant, haven't had any issues. But that is one of the big concerns next winter, also the summer, that the summer when the energy grid gets taxed again, Russia did inflict some kind of permanent damage on the energy grid. So some of those power plants have not been restored. And it is a concern when the energy consumption increases again, that Russia would go after this again. They could create blackouts once again. And of course, there is a risk if the war continues in 2027, that next winter, if it's a cold winter again, people who made it through this last winter, many of them may try and go somewhere else, right? If they think it's going to be another cold winter, just like we had last winter. So that is still kind of one of the big concerns. But I would say, just in this kind of temporary phase, right? It's late spring. It's the weather's nice. The situation is much better, I think, just at least in Kyiv and other places. And so there is a seasonal dimension to it. One other part of the seasonal aspect of fighting is that the seasons and weather affects also kind of the front line too. And so one thing that was difficult of the winter as well, so Russia's Shia campaign of going after energy grid, many of the countermeasures are affected by weather conditions too, right? So last year, Ukrainian helicopters shot down, I think, more than 5,000 one-way attack drones. So they were really key component of Ukraine's kind of defenses there. And over the winter, when there's very low cloud cover, it's much more difficult for helicopters to do this. So they were much less effective. There were some days where F-16s could not fly, and other kind of fighters couldn't fly, which are also a key part of shooting down Shaheds as well as cruise missiles. And then interceptors, right? Interceptors are kind of the big focus the last couple months because of what happened in Iran. But even these interceptors like Sting, P-1 Sun, Merop, so on, they all require some kind of visual navigation, right? There's some kind of optical guidance. And if the cloud cover is too low, they simply are less effective. And so for some reasons, over the winter, the shoot down rate of Shaheds, Garand was lower, and right now it's higher, mostly because the weather has gotten better, right? And so that's a key part of it. But on the front line, there's another aspect to it too, where Russia's preferred tactic is infiltration. Infiltration, it generally involves maybe 1, 2, 3 soldiers, depends on the brigade. The brigades have different kind of ways of doing it. But to get to the front line, you probably have to walk 10 or 15 kilometers. And then they try and walk, several kilometers past the front line. And so these are not, particularly physically fit guys in many cases. Doing this when the weather is warm, like it right now, is much easier than when it was like 0 degrees over the winter. And I'm saying 0 degrees Fahrenheit because it was that, very, very cold. And so infiltration was much more difficult for a few reasons. One was the tree lines go away, right? So deciduous trees, the leaves are not there. There's much less camouflage. The high grass is also gone in some places. So it's harder to kind of consider yourself. Thermal optics are better in winter as well. And so locating people with thermal optics is often easier when it's cold weather. It's harder to survive just from exposure. And also a lot of times infiltration, the guys trying to get past the front line and they try and dig in and tree line somewhere. Well, if the ground is frozen,
Yeah,
it's much tougher to do that. And again, these are not necessarily guys who are physically fit. They're already tired. And so their ability to survive on those conditions is much more difficult. Whereas, you can survive without maybe food and water a little bit more effectively when it's warmer out, but over the winter it's much more difficult.
If you don't mind, I will add something from my experience.
Of course.
Since November 25 till February 26, back then I was in Unmanned direction. We had literally horrible weather conditions. It was all the time foggy. It was impossible to any kind of drone to fly. Of course, we kind of, use some heavy bombers. I don't want to specify which one, not Vampire, to do a reconnaissance during the night because it has a better thermal camera, and at least we were able to see something. For fiber drone optics, well, because of bad temperature, which is not acceptable for them, low temperature, they didn't manage in a lot of cases to reach the target, do proper reconnaissance. So we mostly, relied on SIGINT, and it was very interesting to see how Russians are trying to infiltrate using this weather. In some cases, they managed to do it up to 12, 13 kilometers, and only after that they've been killed by our infantry. And you mentioned that they need to infiltrate and prepare new positions. I need to say that in these cases, none of them had any kind of shovel. They literally tried to use abandoned Ukrainian years ago made positions where they've been killed by drones after that, or just reached some kind of buildings or villages. And you are absolutely right that it's very hard to go during the winter, because in a lot of cases, of course it depends on the terrain, the part of the front line, but if you talk about, for example, the Unmanned direction, their logistic is quite bad for them because they have this natural obstacle, which is river,
right?
And it's hard for them to cross it. Then they need to walk like up to 12 kilometers on foot. Of course, they have some checkpoints where they can have a rest, but in general, it's literally quite hard for them to go. For everyone. And by the way, it was one of the big advantages from Koreans during the cruise operation, because they were physically fit.
Right.
They managed to do what Russians didn't manage to do. They walked on foot like for a lot of kilometers during winter with a lot of gear, like dozens of kilos. So yeah, it's just like a short remark about those people who are saying, oh, during the war, so cold. Drone warfare, you don't need to be physically fit.
Oh yeah,
yeah, which is
it still matters. So
yeah, seems like, which is absolutely ridiculous. And from my own experience, dude, you just take EcoFlow, take shovel, take ammo, take drones, take Starlink, and go on foot, like, even if it's summer or if it's winter, it's still hard. Go like 10 kilometers, and you will see whether you want to be physically fit or not.
In particular, and it is hard to describe, I think sometimes you have to walk through it, but mud is always like ubiquitous, right?
Yeah.
And for a long, it's not just spring and fall, but even like winter, when a day when it gets above freezing, it becomes mud very, very quickly. It'll then freeze again.
Yes.
But when you walk through mud like this, even like I remember going to some of the command posts, and I'm not wearing any gear, right? So I'm not wearing any kind of weight. It's very easy. You're still slipping around in the mud, right?
Yeah.
You're almost falling over. And if you throw on like a pack, gear, so on, it becomes exhausting. And I remember like when I was in Afghanistan, we'd have to walk through like fields where it was like basically it was like agriculture, it was like farm fields, but like flooded kind of like mud basically. And it's just your legs get very tired very, very quickly, especially when you're wearing gear. You're kind of slipping around all over the place. You're trying not to fall. It's very easy to get focused on just walking and not like what else is going around you. It's a big problem.
Yeah.
And as is always the case, if you're physically fit, you can still mentally focus on other things. If you are not physically fit, once you get exhausted, you just kind of go internal. You stop focusing on what you should be focusing on.
You lose attention.
Attention, and then you might run into a mine. You might not choose your route very properly. You might not look for UAVs, and then all sorts of kind of problems come about this.
Yeah, please.
So one I'd add is that, with the kind of kill zone. We'll talk kill zone kind of later because the term is a bit problematic. It's kind of undefined. But as the kill zone has expanded, as right, FPVs and artillery have made it more dangerous behind the zero line, behind the four line of troops. Usually infantry on either side have to walk maybe 10 kilometers or more to get to the front line.
Yeah.
And that means, again, you're doing it on your own. And even before you get to the zero line, you're going to be tired. And this can often involve maybe days of movement, right? Where it's like, hey, you move very deliberately, only at nighttime, only when the weather conditions
for example, during the rain.
Right.
And if you go during the rain, heavy rain, of course, you don't have other clothes to change. You don't have, right? I mean, normal apartment is a warm shelter, anything like that. So it's people really, unfortunately, don't understand this. And even if you wasn't, I don't know, like striking by a FPV drone or any drops from drones, for example, both sides they have drone detections,
right?
And you can detect a drone, you can hear, I mean, with your ears, and you need to move, you need to hide, and those 10 kilometers, it's like a pain in the ass. You will be absolutely tired, and if after that you've been ordered to advance, to storm positions, to infiltrate, you need to have enormous amount of energy to do that.
Yeah,
I mean, both sides they don't have it literally.
No, and again, it's the effect of drones has almost been the opposite, where infantry have to walk further on foot without vehicles because they cannot rely on vehicles getting there. Casualty evacuation, you cannot rely on helicopters coming to get you. Right. Maybe UGVs, but UGVs often get destroyed by the front line too.
In some cases.
Exactly, in some cases. And so now, I mean, again, casualty evacuation often is basically like you need to get yourself out of there, or someone needs to kind of drag you, carry you, some kind of other kind of sling to get you out of there. But again, all this is physically like exhausting.
Absolutely.
And it basically, I think the development of UAVs, at least for the time being, have actually made physical requirements more important because there are guys you have some guys who are operating UGVs or UAVs via Starlink in like a basement somewhere here in Kyiv, but like in like the Lazar group. But you have other people on position, and to get to the position, to leave position, it's a very dangerous thing to do. And you said you've got to physically bring a lot of equipment. And I remember I talked to a battalion commander who's in Konstaha, and Konstaha is maybe the most difficult logistics, basically almost anywhere on the front line, because Russians are kind of impinging on the sides, and the main road that leads from Druzhkivka to Konstaha, this Russian FPVs are constantly hitting anything there, UGVs, vehicles, or. And he was saying that it got so bad that his Mavic teams often had to carry like Mavics with them, their gear with them, because UGVs cannot always make it to their positions. Because usually kind of the way logistics works is UGVs resupply Vampire teams, and then Vampire teams will resupply infantry.
Yes.
Because UGVs typically cannot make to the zero line with gear. They can only do it for casualty evacuation missions usually.
Unfortunately, in very rare cases.
Right.
I mean, usually if you've been injured in the position, I mean, if talking about Ukrainian side, you can be evacuated during the bad weather. You, for example, a comrade in the position can bring you, to a couple of kilometers away from the position, like 2, 3, 4 kilometers, and then you might be evacuated by UGV. So it's also quite an operation at the position to be evacuated if you're injured. And if you're talking about Russian side, of course, we're not talking about any kind of evacuation.
Right.
If you go before the flat, I mean, so cold, and you do this infiltration, if you've been injured, it's instant death. So in general, all these tactics that was caused not only by drones, by the way, as people may think, but also by the artillery.
Right.
Because in 2024, it used to be like 7, 10 Russian stormtroopers. Sometimes it was infantry fighting vehicle or on their foot. They literally stormed the positions of Ukrainian army. They didn't try to avoid, they stormed. And of course, they were suppressed and killed by artillery and by drones.
Right.
But mostly, and you say by mostly, suppressed, injured, killed by artillery back then. And it led to change the tactics to this infiltration, because it's very hard to kill one Russian dude with artillery rounds.
Right.
So they need to adapt. I don't want to say that this adaptation is the right way of doing. It's literally you're vanishing your capabilities as a brigade. So they did it. And right now I saw a report from Russia side maybe 2 months ago, maybe less, that the 55th Marine Division that was redeployed from Dobropillia to Oleksandrivka direction, they made conclusion that this infiltration is not effective. We are losing too many people. We're achieving barely nothing, in most cases at least. So we need to. So the conclusion was that we need to wait a little bit till the bad weather. I mean, during summer it will be much harder to wait when the bad weather will be, and need to wait to the bad weather and use more vehicles, because during the assault right now with so-called drone warfare, you may use vehicles, but in most cases you will lose it.
Right.
But the point is that during this operation with vehicles, survivability of your assault troops is higher than they are doing this kind of infiltration. Because, I mean, honestly, naturally, most of drone operators, they're focusing if they see a tank, especially right now, infantry fighting vehicle, they pay a lot of attention to it.
Yeah, and so, and you make a good point about the role of artillery and drones together, because some people have come to different conclusions about this war, right? Some would think that armor is now like obsolete. Some would think artillery is kind of like not that important, because we know that majority of casualties are caused by drones on both sides, right? And different estimates, but usually here like more than 80%. And last fall, I talked to a bunch of brigade battalion commanders in parts of the front, and that was generally the view. It was like 75% or higher of the casualties, also on the Russian side too, according to their own like kind of internal calculations. But it's important to keep in mind the reason we see infiltration tactics is that, as you said, if you do a squad or platoon dismounted infantry assaults, if a UAV locates them, artillery very quickly can destroy these kind of guys, right? And again, especially with DPICM, with cluster munitions, you only need a couple rounds, and you can really effectively suppress and then destroy these
They
troops.
don't care about the weather, the wind, fog. Artillery open fire immediately and kills.
Exactly. And so, again, my view of infiltration reason, and this segues into kind of talking about 2025, but infiltration is a response to both Ukraine's strengths and weaknesses. So the strength being UAS combined with artillery, right? Reconnaissance and artillery is a very potent combination. And you talk about the North Koreans. I talked to some of the guys who fought the North Koreans in the beginning, and basically the first week, the North Koreans made pretty significant advances, relative to this war, which is not very far. But the first week there was really bad weather, but basically the Russians put up a lot of ISR UAVs. So they put up a bunch of Orlan, Super Cams, so on. And there's so many of the time that basically Ukraine the units there could not intercept them, which meant essentially artillery would refuse to open up. So like if we open fire, the Orlan will locate us and we'll get targeted very quickly. And so they're essentially like effectively suppressed by the presence of ISR overhead. And so for the first couple of days, Ukrainian artillery did very little to kind of go after the North Koreans. The North Koreans were assaulting in like platoon, company-sized kind of formations, which you'd not seen in a long time. And it was a big problem because ultimately they just overwhelmed the Ukrainian units over there because, again, the density of infantry on the front line is not that great, and North Koreans were assaulting in large numbers. And sure, they're losing guys, but, most of the casualties the first couple of days, it was by like FPVs, maybe AGS-17s, right? But it was not significant enough to kind of hold them back given the disparity in infantry. And then after a few days, when the ISR was not such a problem, Ukrainian artillery started opening up. And the North Koreans took very heavy casualties very quickly because, there's mass together, and DPICM, other munitions can just do a lot of damage.
Absolutely.
And so even, the first couple of days, I think most casualties are caused by Mavic drops, FPVs, AGS-17s. But then a few days later, artillery is doing most of the killing. And then the North Koreans had to adjust their tactics because they had to go away from, platoon company-sized assaults to, squad or smaller, essentially. They didn't go to infiltration the same way, but they definitely decreased the size. And as you said, for them, all the guys I talked to fought against North Koreans came away thinking these guys are quite impressive people because, the tactics were not ready for the type of warfare they're facing, but they adapted quite quickly. They're very, very brave. I mean, only 2 guys were captured, and my understanding is that they were captured kind of by accident. They thought they
definitely didn't want to be captured.
I think I was told, maybe I'm wrong. The 2 guys who were captured thought it was Russians who came up on them and not Ukrainians, and they
Can
didn't.
be.
Yeah,
I mean,
they
I
didn't.
can easily believe in this.
They didn't realize that.
No.
But I mean, many cases of them committing suicide, even when they were not even that badly wounded, it was just, but this kind of ideological
Yes.
commitment was just very, very impressive. And you said, like, they're very physically fit, so they're carrying full rucksacks into combat. When they do Kazavac, they literally put a guy over their back and just run them out of there. And again, with the snow, with everything else, incredibly difficult moving with weight. And these guys are carrying other guys out of there pretty much every time. So these guys are very tough fighters. They did adapt pretty quickly. And fortunately, they've not come into Ukraine because they were like a real potent force. But that was a kind of important takeaway. And one thing I could get back to, so it's important you mentioned the cold weather. So in the summertime, if you infiltrate, you can kind of either find a basement somewhere or you can just dig in a position yourself. In the wintertime, you pretty much have to find a already prepared position, right? And so, in some cases, infiltration, the guys will only look to villages and only try and find a village where you can kind of like survive. Summertime, you can go to a forest or tree line and just survive in that tree line.
Yes.
So there's more opportunities for guys to infiltrate past the front line and kind of create positions elsewhere. And typically the tactic is one or two at a time who kind of go forward. And often they might be have a Mavic following them, and the commanders kind of watch them through a Mavic, telling them where to go. If they get engaged by Ukrainian infantry, typically the next guy will be sent. It'll be sent to go around them, so he doesn't run into the same position. And then, depending on the terrain, they'll infiltrate a certain number of kilometers past the front line. And then once they can build up a force there, like not just one, but you send like 4, 5, 6 guys, then they'll try and keep moving forward, or they'll try and find like a Mavic position or something like that. But that's still kind of the basic tactic, and it was developed in 2025. But it's easier to do that when you've got vegetation, when it's warmer, and it's easier to resupply. All those kind of things are just easier at this kind of time. And so that's one reason why, for seasonal reasons, while the battlefield may become more difficult this summer, although it's hard, as you said though, it's hard to kind of be specific at the timing here because it's already spring, right? We're well into spring. The tree lines have already come back to some extent. Yep. And we haven't seen significant Russian advances, right? And depending on the mappers you look at, the advances have been like, I think, Deep State is saying, I think like 140 square kilometers what gains last month for Russia, which is not that significant.
Yeah, but the same amount of this territory was taken back. It's not like 10 or 15 square kilometers, much more, like dozens. So in general, they took not 140, less. So because we do some small counterattacks, I mean, they're not that significant, but we continue doing that. And you mentioned one thing that I kind of witnessed when I was in one direction. It was exactly during the summer. There were 2 tree lines and a field between them. So they had to leave the tree line and walk, like on the open field. And firstly, they sent one Russian, literally just to jump into the tree line, but he found a landmine that I placed, and he was killed. The second one was ordered to go like maybe 50 meters away from that place, and also to do that, he also found a mine. It was on the next day. The third one was ordered to go like directly from one tree line to another one through the field, and he entered the tree line. Because in that case, literally, it's kind of impossible to understand how they're gonna work for this day. Right. Of course, with the help of Seguin, with the help of understanding what kind of application do they use, this Alpina you mentioned, of course they are telling by radio or maybe by a microphone on the Mavic. It also happens that you need to go from the point 556 to point 678, for example. And that Russian dude, he's literally walking like that, and Russians are observing what's happening to him. If he'd been killed, okay, they're trying to change a little bit. Of course, it sounds definitely not like any kind of military should act. But right now they're doing this in this way, and I think that they realized, they fully understand that it's not efficient, that they need to come back to maneuver warfare, in which I believe it is possible during this again so-called drone warfare with all the time, like that you can observe the front line. It's possible, but you need to do some preparations before that. And that's why all of this that we discussed, I believe that that's why I'm positive. I believe that for this year we will be able to do some operations. Of course, it's not gonna be in like 2023 type of operation, but much smaller one, maybe a couple of them. But I think that we will show that you can do maneuvers and not just during the fog, like in November.
Yeah.
So I think that infiltration for this year won't be that efficient as it used to be, because in general you don't need to panic if it happens. If Russians manage to so-called break through, it doesn't mean that they control the area. I mean, our commanders, most of them, found a way how to deal with that. You also have some small reserves, some reconnaissance teams, for example, with support of our SOF/Rangers, with drone teams who are literally have this task to clear the buildings, clear the basements, clear the part of the tree line, and kill those Russians who managed to infiltrate. Firstly, it was like a panic, because sometimes also they use like ATVs to manage to break through ASAP. Of course, we didn't know how to deal with that, and it caused a lot of problems. Especially, I remember in 2024, Volcano-Vasilivka direction, they managed to advance quite a lot. Right now, it will be harder and harder. So I think they will need to find a way how to adapt, especially after this middle strike campaign, where we are targeting their logistics and their capabilities literally to fight.
Yeah, and so let's take a step back and kind of go through how to develop. So, Russia's been they've had the strategic initiative since like October 2023, right? When Battle of Avdiivka began again. Back in Avdiivka, it began. Russia conducted like battalion-sized mechanized assaults, right? The last time we saw this, we had multiple companies trying to maneuver at the same time. That didn't succeed, right? They did advance, but it was costly and they totally,
and they didn't manage to succeed, and we didn't have that much drones back then.
Right.
It was stopped by remotely placed mines. Okay, with help of drones, by artillery and by ATGMs. Also important to notice.
The Lazar group did destroy almost a full battalion in one night.
I know,
but yes,
it took part in, as far as I remember, during February, something like that. But before that,
yeah, absolutely. And so we go back 3 years ago, well, less than that. So Russia's conducting battalion-sized mechanized assaults. Then, as 2024 progressed, right, we continue to see company-sized mechanized assaults, pretty commonly. But then they all started doing more dismounted things, right? So dismounted platoon, maybe squad, right? And so maybe platoon in early 2024. By the end of 2024 is more like squad size, fire team size, right? And this is kind of also what Ukraine did in summer 2023, where initially it was mechanized assaults. When those failed, and then they would kind of adjust it with like platoon, squad size infantry assaults, and then kind of went back to vehicle and so on. So when we get to 2025, basically Russia's typically operating a squad size or smaller, usually I say fire team size, like 6 to 4, something like that, assault groups. And then, I think the big story of 2025 is that Russia had a couple of adaptations, but really two kind of adaptations that are important, right? First is infiltration, where, and we already kind of talked about what this looks like. Instead of sending, a platoon assault, where we have all 30, 40 guys at once, send 30, 40 guys at one day, one at a time, or two at a time. And then many of them will get killed, but some of them will get through. And then if after 3 or 4 days, you might have, a squad or whatever of guys who've made it past the front line, and they're now somewhere behind the forward line of troops. And you said, when that was used initially, if you're not prepared for this kind of thing, it's quite concerning. Because if you're the infantryman at the front line, you have Russians behind you. You might now feel that you're being encircled, that you're being abandoned, right? And you might think, how am I going to be resupplied? How am I going to survive? And you said Ukraine brigades adapted to this, where they basically said, okay, just because there's presence of Russians behind your infantry does not mean these positions are unsustainable. And as long as you can basically resupply them with logistics by UAVs, you can actually continue to hold it. And you said kind of Ukraine developed, they kind of adapted to this adaptation over 2025. Reconnaissance battalions within brigades or elsewhere, SSO, assault units, so on. You create these units as kind of dedicated counter-infiltration groups, right? And these are often better trained than regular infantry, so infantry are holding their positions. and these guys will come up just to clear out, positions behind. So like Azov Brigade had very good, success with this. Third Corps is doing the same thing. And basically, that's reconnaissance units became not reconnaissance units, they became counter-infiltration essentially.
Yeah.
And so that was a quite kind of important development. As you said, also UAV teams had to start focusing on things behind the front line. So you're not just trying to kill Russian soldiers in front of the front line, but how do you make it unsustainable for Russians behind you? And I think one thing that happened with infiltration, so the front line stopped being a real front line. You always have Russians kind of behind Ukrainian positions to some extent. What becomes important though is it becomes like a clinch kind of. Like that's how it was described to me by one Brigade S2. It's kind of like two boxers in a clinch, and you're kind of wrestling for position. But it really becomes a question of who can sustain your infantry. So I mean, again, the Russians, when they infiltrate behind the line, they sustain them with Molnia, with UAVs. They'll drop kind of supplies to them. Ukrainian infantry are also resupplied by vampires. Now, if one side can knock out the other side's UAVs, then your infantry become, unsustainable because they're not getting resupplied, and that can be one way they kind of move forward. But ultimately, the presence of Russians behind your position is not critical necessarily, as long as you kind of can conceptualize this and realize how to deal with it. And that's something that kind of developed across 2025. There's still problems. So in Huyapoya, when the Russians went back in the offensive in January, there were some TDF brigades in that direction who had not seen much kind of fighting recently, had not kind of been, had seen the latest.
They had stagnation
Right.
for years.
And that's something that happens on the front line, where you have some brigades that are constantly fighting. So they're constantly innovating, seeing new TTPs, responding to it. When you're on a kind of less active part of the front line, you may not, know what the most recent Russian TTPs are, and you might not be ready for them. And the way it was described to me when I went down there was when the first infiltration groups kind of got behind the TDF infantry, some of the infantry didn't know how to respond to it. They did not have a kind of as well developed system to kind of deal with this, and that's why they kind of got pushed back quite quickly. But then the assault regiments got deployed down there, and they kind of stabilized the situation, and it's been kind of fine ever since then. But this is one of the big developments of 2025, is that right when it began, a lot of Ukrainian brigades did not know how to handle it initially. And then Russia was able to kind of, I think, advance faster in 2025 than 2024 because they had kind of innovated in this respect. And so I think infiltration was part of it. And the second one I would kind of emphasize is that Russian employment of drones improved in 2025. So
yeah, it's not comparable to what they had in 2024. It became just more. It looks like, at least 24, it looked like more like Ukraine has. So they really adopted, they made some changes. And it's not only Rubicon related, it's also about the maneuver brigades, like Marine, VDV brigades. They did a lot of kind of, homework to change it. And in some cases, I need to say is that in 2025, some of the ideas unfortunately, much more smarter than Ukrainian ones. But thanks God they're not scaling this. So just they, different battalion, regiment commanders, they are trying to test something their own. I mean, from both sides, and both sides don't have this kind of doctrine still. Both sides don't really understand fully how to implement different type of drones, like O1 drones, copter type, FPV drones, different kind of flying capabilities. So but as you said, in 2025 they did a big move. That's definitely not comparable to what they had in 2024.
And that's this became kind of clear during Kursk, right? So beginning 2025, again, the seasonal dimension to the fighting. So Russia typically advances slower in the winter because of different reasons, and it kind of always spring. Last February, basically, Russia developed the Rubicon Center. So that was under the initiative of Minister Belousov. He came in May 2024. Rubicon was officially created in August 2024, but really got kind of scaled in the fall. And Kursk was kind of its first real combat experience, right? And so they had 3 detachments that were operating there. And a big part of what happened in Kursk is that they deployed this kind of new concept where we're going to use our strike junior units. We're going to use the elite ones. We're going to reinforce kind of one part of the front line, and we're going to deliberately go after logistics. So we're going to make logistics as difficult as possible. And if you can do that, that was their kind of theory of how to advance on a tactical level, essentially. And, you know, to Suja, there's one main road. There are kind of two roads. One main road that led to Suja to Sumy. And basically Rubicon would look at one part of the road for like 300 meters long, basically, and say, we're going to basically knock out any vehicle that tries to come along this road. And quite successful in this. And again, this is a significant number of fiber optic FPVs. So it was also early when fiber optic FPVs were being used. And basically this kind of way of reinforcing drone units, strike drone units, and one part of the front line proved to be kind of decisive at the tactical level, where basically it made logistics so difficult for Ukraine. Rotations became very difficult. They couldn't reach supplies effectively. And then it became much more difficult to hold back Russian infantry as they tried to push forward.
Yeah, I mean, during the Kursk, it's interesting to notice that we had awful weather conditions, not for ISR drones. I mean, Mavics and Autel, they've been flying, and I think, okay, not everything, but it was acceptable for them.
Right.
But no ISR drones. So the point is that, as you said, they just chose the part of the front line, the main logistic road, and it was very bad from our side to have maybe one or two roads.
Right.
Because in my case, in case of my company, we didn't use that road much because it was used by tanks, artillery, trucks. First of all, it became really bad road.
Right.
No one fixed it. So it took us much more time to get to the position. And secondly, it just was dangerous because back then they had Tornado S.
Right.
And honestly, I all the time expected that during seeing all those convoys, I've never seen anything like that before and after. So much tanks, so much SPGs,
right.
trucks were driving on daily and nightly basis, and were not hit at all. So they chose this part of the road, like maybe 300 meters, maybe a couple of kilometers. And what really helps them that they had enormous financial support by MOD and their sponsors.
Right.
Like in our case, I was told that, okay, if I want to strike a Russian BMD, I need to have a video from a DJI that's confirming that I managed to hit it. And it was like, dude, I need to do reconnaissance better instead of filming that I managed to strike it. If it's burning up, okay, I'm fine. If it's not, I will sell maybe another one. So I was forced, all of us have been forced to do that. But in their case, they didn't care about that because ISR were not flying. They just had, seems like, enormous amount of drones. They were hitting literally everything. And the thing is that they didn't create anything new as to that. Okay, fiber drones, fine, acceptable. But Russians were suffering for this kind of attacks by radio drones from our side, like for more than a year.
Right.
And for me, it was, I just wasn't able to understand how is it possible that everyone right now is so surprised by what Rubicon is doing. They literally, I don't want to say copy paste it because this is what should be done to cut the logistics, but they literally did the same. And like 90% of the brigades and commanders were like, oh wow, look what they're doing. We are not able to move anymore. And while using this one or maybe two logistic roads. So that's kind of one thing. And another thing that before Rubicon arrived, honestly, we almost, maybe in 9 out of 10 cases, we were fine using these roads. And it also was surprisingly for me. I didn't understand why Russian VDV divisions and Marine Brigade, they didn't strike it.
Right.
I don't know, why do you need like to create some kind of separate detachment who will be responsible for that? And same with drone operator positions. They try to launch those fiber drones. I don't know who, maybe VDV, maybe Rubicon against our operators. But we literally just had nets around the position, and they didn't manage to kill, injure, or destroy anything there. So yeah, but as you said, this kind of development, they achieved a lot from that, and unfortunately, it was successful for them.
And so, if we go back to 2025, right, Kursk is kind of the template they applied, right? So you have Rubicon, which is very new. You have Grom Cascade. You have, of course, VDV naval infantry typically have better kind of strike drone capabilities internally. And so you had a very small part of the front line, this really significant focus of strike drone capabilities. Right? Also, Russian SOs there, FSB, Alpha units. And so they take back Kursk like basically into February, early March. Then a bunch of the Rubicon units redeployed to Donetsk region. And then that's when a lot of units there started really feeling pressure, right? In Konstaha area, other parts of the front line. But this became, at least the way I kind of viewed it, is that the way Russia looked at Ukrainian brigades, so their kind of theory of how to advance, it was their view was the center of gravity for Ukraine was UAV teams, right? And it's not surprising because at this point, UAS is responsible for maybe 80% or more casualties, right? We know that most vehicle losses also from drones. And so it basically became, for Russia to advance, they have to either sufficiently suppress or degrade Ukrainian UAV teams in order to advance, right? So that became the priority. The other one was logistics, where it's like, okay, we can also advance by cutting off logistics, and then, sometimes Ukraine can't hold, certain positions. And so that, I remember I talked to some brigades in July 2025 who were in these areas. And like in some cases, I asked, like, why is Russia advancing? In some cases, it literally was like Rubicon showed up. Our previous way of doing logistics became like impossible, and we had to kind of adapt. But initially, they kind of would advance because Ukraine couldn't sustain positions in some areas. And then it really became this new system of how to do logistics to the front line, right? And so, we said before, right, UGVs have been scaled dramatically. And so now, normal Ukraine brigade has probably a UGV company using the UAV battalion, although it kind of varies. Some cases, regular infantry battalions will have UGV platoons too. And so you have these kind of organic logistics kind of capabilities at battalion or brigade level. And then typically the UGVs are used to resupply the UAV positions. So, heavy bomber drone positions like Vampires, FPV, Mavic, so on. Most logistics is then moved to UAV positions. And then again, UAVs are doing most of the killing. And so they need more munitions themselves, because the infantry are not really, for the most part, they're not fighting that much. They do get into firefights, but for the most part, most Russian soldiers are killed by drones instead. So munitions really need to go to the UAV positions, not the infantry positions. And then for infantry, you need to get them food, water, whatever the kind of basic supplies, right? Batteries and so on. And so logistics is trying to change, but now the system that Ukraine has, where Vampires drop infantry, UGVs get to Vampire positions. You have a good number of UGVs now. So the plan for the first 6 months of this year is to contract 25,000 UGVs, another 25,000 for the second half. And then Vampires are also just huge numbers of Vampires. They're quite cheap as well. And so that the cost ratio here is kind of makes sense, where you can do logistics because the drones you're using are much cheaper than they used to be. And so I think these kind of two things is kind of how Ukraine has adapted to what Russia did in 2025, right? One with the infiltration, the second with kind of these UAV capabilities, improved UAV capabilities. And now, Ukraine has kind of adapted and figured a way of handling that. So I'd say, last summer, this was still a really difficult situation. The combination of these two things was difficult. We talk about Russia for the UAS development. So part of it was Rubicon, right? Rubicon got a lot of attention because they were quite good. They're quite elite. Initially, they certainly had very high quality people, right? They brought in like high quality people. You had to be under the age of 40. They were going after guys who are gamers and other guys who were background in VDV, soft.
They did interviewed a lot of people, and they have a lot of open vacancies, and they had a lot of opportunities from whom to decide to choose. And they had this ability to choose the best one from their opinion, and they did it.
And they get paid more too. So like Grom Cascade, Rubicon, they get paid like what SO specialist gets paid, which is far more than a regular soldier. And so they had very good selection criteria. So it was like, we're not taking anyone. We're going to try only take the best people. As you said, the funding was very substantial because again, it was Minister Bill also. This is his creation. And so the Minister of Defense himself realizes a good area of kind of, direction of funding, of support. And so, one thing that separated them is the same thing I heard too, is that they have so many UAVs where if they're going to task to cut off like this road, they have enough FPVs to keep flying them. And okay, even if they're missing, even if the weather's bad, because in many cases when the weather's really bad, a normal unit will say, look, we can't afford to use FPVs today or that many of them because we only have a certain amount and so on. Rubicon can just send as many as they want to because they have just a almost unlimited supply. And so that was really important development. What they did in 2025 too, usually, is they deploy kind of one part of the front line. They might operate for 5 or 7 days, then move somewhere else. And I remember I talked to 2 brigades who faced them, and they basically said, When they showed up, one brigade lost 70% of their UAV positions within a week because Rubicon just located them and kind of knocked these positions out. They didn't kill or wounded all the soldiers, but they basically made the positions untenable. So not that the antennas, the bunkers, the blindage, so on. And another brigade says like 40% over like span of a week. And that's really the main focus, I think I would say last year, was that the Rubicon would go after logistics at greater depth from the front line or UAV positions. Those are two main priorities initially, but it didn't ultimately lead to a breakthrough. I think this is kind of the big thing to keep in mind. Is like it was a big problem. Like if you talk to the Ukrainian brigades, they'd all say yes, it's a problem, like so on. But ultimately, it didn't enable a breakthrough, and it didn't enable Russia to use armor effectively again. And this is really what comes back to. And we're still talking; it's a positional fight. Both sides believe armor is important. Like no one I talk to thinks armor is obsolete. They think this is how you do offensive operations. How you set conditions to use armor again effectively is the question. How do you do this? It's going to take more effort. Rubicon was, I think, part of this, where Russia's kind of view is, okay, in order to use armor again, we need Rubicon to set conditions to maybe suppress the grade UAV positions, and then we can bring up armor at this one point on the front line. It didn't succeed, at least thus far. But I think the concept made sense, right? I think the execution was maybe the flawed part. And I know that, people I talk to say that when Russia would do mechanized assaults, so Rubicon would put liaison officers in the brigade headquarters. So they then kind of coordinate, they'd see what reconnaissance the brigade is doing, and they'll see how we can support them and so on. They would support offensive operations, but clearly it was not sufficient to, sufficiently degrade, suppress Ukrainian UAV positions to prevent them from stopping these assaults.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I need to add one unpleasant thing to say that, unfortunately, I like what they are doing, because for me, Rubicon, first of all, it's not about striking crews, which are definitely used to be skillful.
Yeah,
they had a lot of financial support. That's absolutely right. But for me, first of all, Rubicon, it's R&D center, not just for hardware or software, but also for approbation of different kind of tactics. Russians still suffering, and will continue suffering a lot from our heavy bombers. It was a very big problem for them. And they didn't know how to deal with that. Of course, they use, I remember during Crimea operation, they use a lot the APCs with thermal. And they saw that the so-called Baba Yaga is flying through the river, so they were shooting and destroying it. Not that often, but they've been. Later, they tried to use their sniper platoon, also with thermals.
Yeah.
They've been covering some kind of logistic roads, some important positions. So if they're here, they're looking with a thermal and also trying to shoot it. After that, they increased the amount of those observation posts with machine guns, with maybe some electronic warfare, stuff like that. Of course, it also was kind of a little bit painful for us, but it still wasn't enough at all. So they did this approbation of tactics, which was right now is commonly used. Where they are putting a small radio station, which is capable of tracking flying objects, and then they send an interceptor drone, just regular FPV, like Boomerang or BT-40 with thermal vision, and destroying this Baba Yaga type drone in the air, because they know that because of lack of accuracy from these drones, we need to drop munitions under 200 meters, and they're literally flying in some kind of area like 220 meters, and they are able to see literally everything what's going beneath them, and that's why they managed to destroy a big amount of this type of drones. Right now, this tactic is being approbated and approved, and right now scaled. Another thing is countering fixed-wing ISR drones, because they remember how it was for our side in 2023, while we were advancing, and Russians literally saw everything. All our mechanized companies, battalions, like a dozen kilometers before the front line. So they understood that it's also a threat for them. And they saw how Ukrainians are countering them, because it was a big threat for us, like Iran-type drones and Russian ISR. That led to Iskander strikes and Cup strikes and etc. So they also did approbation of this. Well, they copy-pasted, but still they did approbation of these tactics. Right now it's scaled. Right now, as you know, Russians are putting a lot of attention to countermeasuring drones. It's gonna be a top priority for 2026. They wanna definitely decrease the amount of heavy bomber drones and the fixed-wing kamikaze drones. They're building trying to build at least three echelons of these interceptor systems, which requires to have a big amount of small radar systems. Mostly it's like Chinese AU-80 or some Russian made stuff. But right now they also do approbation of much smaller radar systems that will be placed not like 20 kilometers from the front line, but maybe like 6 kilometers from the front lines that will be able to track drones up to 8 kilometers. So the point is for them to create this counter field of detection and kind of protection of their troops who are advancing or in defense. So it's gonna be an issue for us. I don't want to say that they're doing this in a good pace, but still they're doing this. And as I mentioned today before, in some cases they have much better point of view about that. For example, they're creating this counter-UAS battery under every regiment or brigade that will consist of 52 or 53 personnel, and they will have, like, as far as I remember, from 4 to 6 small radar stations. We don't have this kind of capabilities, and you literally can detach these crews with kind of radar type radars to your battalions and flag them. And if your battalion will be able to have these smaller detection systems, radars, so it's gonna be much harder for us. And if you combine this with electronic warfare, with observation posts, so yeah, they're trying to create this big protection system. And about Rubicon, yeah, they scaled a lot this year, and they lose their quality.
Right.
This is what happens when you're scaling. Frankly speaking, I don't really see the value of scaling Rubicon exactly. I mean, from my point of view, I would rather have this small center with a couple of detachments, who will do approbation of tactics and different drone software, hardware, and then we'll kind of have this unlimited financial support and do something bigger for the whole army. But instead of that, they craned in dozens of detachments. So that it seems like that in the future will become just like VAV battalions under this unmanned system forces that they created this year.
So I think in 2025, it was an important development because Russia typically has been less innovative than Ukraine, right? The Russian military, I think, is generally less innovative than the Ukrainian military. It's much more top down. It's much more centralized, so on. And bottom up kind of ideas do not get latched onto by senior officers at nearly as fast as they should. And the Russian military, there's still a military culture that is detrimental to innovation, I'd say, right? So Rubicon was kind of, and I was somewhat compared to Ukrainian drone units because many of the top drone units that developed in Ukraine these are all new units. These are not part of the Ukrainian military. It was things where you had individuals who saw a kind of need and saw, let's kind of provide some new capability. And it was usually people who are not serving the military on February 24th, right? It was Magyar, it was Pavel Yarozarov from Lazar Group, it was a variety of the people. I mean, most of the drone kind of unit commanders were not military officers. They were guys who were civilians. And the units they started, Lazar Group is like 98% are people who were not serving the military when the war began. And so, and there's pros and cons. There's pros to having a military background, like understanding how militaries think. There's also cons to that, right? For any military, where you get kind of indoctrinated into military doctrine, and that can sometimes, make you think a certain way. And so I certainly think that some of these Ukrainian drone units that developed and were very effective, they benefited from having civilian kind of expertise, right? Guys who are civilians, who are, their 40s, 50s, who, spent their time learning as businessmen, as IT specialists.
Top managers, literally.
Right. And they brought that different mindset to creating a drone unit. And I think there's a lot of value there.
Sure.
Rubicon is also similar in that respect, where it seems as though is more of a different than the Russian military. We're going to provide more of a kind of civilian-style mindset to operations, away from the way the Russian military typically operates. I think that was one of the initial kind of benefits. One of the things that was beneficial is obviously they had very good funding. They had their own rules, could kind of do things separately the Russian military. And they were also directly connected to the industrial kind of companies, right? The UAV producers. And so for Molnia, right, they'd go and test something, and then immediately call the producer and say, I want you to make this change. And they produce.
Yeah, this is what we are doing.
Right. Ukraine does that very well. There are a lot of defense companies who immediately take feedback and update them very quickly. And Russia, that was not nearly as effective usually. With Rubicon, they actually had the authority to kind of say, I want you to change these 3 things. And then the companies actually listen to them, and they test them, and then they would then spread it across Russian military, right? So, okay, we develop a new TTP. We do R&D ourselves. They had their own R&D within the center, and then they were tasked with spreading that across the front line. And so basically, there's a positive externality here where they could innovate very quickly. They had the funding to innovate very quickly. And then when they actually developed new useful SOP or TTP, they could then they were responsible for training the rest of the military on it and spreading those kind of TTPs. And so it led to a qualitative improvement in regular Russian brigades, the UAV units they had there. That was important. That was part of the dynamic of last year. Obviously, it didn't lead to a breakthrough, but it did improve their kind of capabilities. I think they narrowed the gap with Ukraine on UAV employment last year. Now we're seeing, I think, Ukraine breaking away again, right? We're seeing in a variety of respects where Ukraine has an advantage, I think, in employment, but of innovation, qualitative employment kind of advantage. And you said with Rubicon, when they stood up initially, so they had 6 main detachments, right? 1 for each group of forces, and you had a reserve detachment, right? Each of these detachments was like, TO is 150 personnel, roughly, but in reality, it's like 120 to 150 personnel, right? So they're small, they kind of very focused, and they're very narrowly focused on certain things, right? So as you said, the strike capabilities was, we're going to knock out logistics here, we're going to knock out UAV teams here at greater depths than what regular brigades can do. They also had the air defense component. So we're going to knock out fixed-wing drones, we're going to knock out bomber drones, and they were the ones to do that.
Kamikaze drones also is important for them to, especially right now, yeah.
And regular Russian brigades were way too slow about this. They're way too slow to develop countermeasures here, whereas Rubicon essentially did it, and then they kind of started spreading that across. So now Russian regiments brigades are supposed to have their own, like their air defense guys, transitioned from just operating Stolatim to operating FPV interceptors too, right? And they've kind of increased that, but the Russian system of counter-UAS is very much behind Ukraine, right? Ukraine has a much more sophisticated, I'd say, echelon counter-UAS capability, but going from countering, Goran Shahed type drones, which we can see right now, where Ukraine is shooting down a very high percentage of these things, both at a strategic level and operational level. Russia's having a lot of issues at operational depth, countering them.
Yeah, they do.
But also just ISR. And one of the big developments for technologically this war, as you said, Russia in 2024, the combination of Orlan with Lancet and Iskander was a huge problem. Like winter, spring of 2024, the Kharkiv offensive, Ukraine lost a lot of artillery to these systems. It's a really big problem. And then Ukraine was able to scale, radar radar with FPV interceptors. And this system they created really changed the battlefield just significantly. And so I think Ukraine still has a really significant advantage there. Russia is struggling in this respect. But in 2025, they really depend on Rubicon to fix these issues, right? Because the broader military is not innovating fast enough. Rubicon is kind of separate to the military in that respect, where it's kind of a different organization, it's like a civilian kind of idea. They're well funded, and they could come in and fix these things, but the extent to which you could scale it was still a problem, because you cannot scale high quality unit, right? It's impossible to scale eliteness, because if it's elite, by definition, it has to be kind of small. And last year you had 7 attachments initially, then they had Rubicon distance mining, Rubicon 7, Rubicon 8, and now Rubicon has 17 attachments plus 2 battalions, 6 companies, and other kind of capabilities. And the attachments last year, they were supposed to be like 149 personnel. Now they're 474 personnel, and so they've massively increased the size. But they've done that also by poaching, right, UAV teams from the brigades. And so,
that's another big issue, and I'm very glad that it's happening. But I will come back to this countermeasuring system. I think that the big advantage for MSI, it's not radar, Poltavka, or any type of drone. It's not Sting, Technotaras, or any other type of drone. It's not drone operators. First of all, it's software that we have and decentralization of data.
Yeah.
Russia seems like full okay in terms of decentralization of data, because they definitely don't want to copy paste what we have in terms of Delta and Russia. They're totally fine with that. And this is what NATO countries don't really understand. While you have this problem with classified, Russia is quite open to that. And right now they are developing different type of software for their army level that will be also implemented in battalion, regiment, brigade level, and higher, of course. And they are trying to copy paste what we did. They will succeed in that. Maybe it's not gonna be that smart, maybe that user friendly, but it will be at least something that most of countries apart from Ukraine and Russia do not have. It's going to be a huge advantage from them against NATO countries, for example. And you mentioned that Rubicon is scaling, and they started taking people from maneuver brigades. Unfortunately, this is what we did years ago. Unfortunately, my company and we did this mistake because we should have stayed in maneuver brigade, because right now I have this understanding. Because maneuver brigades, they have responsibility, first of all, for their infantry, and secondly, for the part of the front line they're holding. And while those unmanned system forces from both sides right now, they're responsible for striking, for literally just for striking, but no one in asking themselves whether it's okay to strike this type of targets here and right now. But yeah, it's definitely another topic. So they're taking drone crews from maneuver brigades, and those Russian maneuver brigades, regiments, divisions in general, they're losing their capabilities of doing reconnaissance and striking. But if you have, for example, your division has tasks to advance, to capture this village, this part of the tree line, this area, forest or whatever, you need to rely on your own crews, on your own infantry. Rubicon is not gonna send a Mavic and to make and follow your infantry advancing kind of. They will be busy with doing something else. And the thing is that those maneuver forces are losing their capabilities. And I'm very glad that they making the same mistake we did, because it also shows that both sides seems like don't really understand, at least till the end, how to do it properly, how to integrate drones into this, like daily war routine, which is absolutely fine because it's something new. And of course, in Ukraine, you may ask different people and hear different opinions about how to use it properly. How to divide responsibilities. But they're doing this. 17 detachments requires a lot of personnel. And right now they have severe problems in terms of recruiting people, because they had a plan. They have a plan to recruit a lot of young students.
For unmanned forces in general.
In general, yes. But I mean, Rubicon will be part of this.
Of course,
it will be transformed into just battalions or whatever. To recruit young students like 19, 20, 22 year old, because they have decent motorics with their hands. They understand, they can adapt quickly. I mean, this is what you need for, at least right now, for drone operators. But they are failing. For 4 months, they managed to recruit only 16% of what is needed. I mean, basic math tells us that they're gonna lack a lot of personnel from this.
I think it was, so unmanned forces for Russia was 87,000 by the end of 2025. The plan is to get to 168,000 by the end of this year. The plan for April 1st was to be 100,000. I think they've still missed that though. And as you said, I mean, this is kind of their theory of success, right? It's they're slower to adopt drones. They're slower to scale them. Belousov certainly sees this as a priority, but I think Russia still looks at this too much in a quantitative way and not a qualitative way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not sure whether if you take some personnel from maneuver brigade and then you send them to unmanned system, you can say that you fulfilled the plan
Right.
because you're literally using the same resources.
But you're just transferring guys around.
Yes.
And like this is you hinted this before, but one of the controversies about Ukraine's admissive forces is that okay, you're creating this new structure, but to scale these new, and again, the initial idea was line of drones. You set up 5, the best kind of most efficient drone units in the Ukrainian military. And you try and scale them by additional funding, by increasing their size. They can operate at greater depths in the front line, right? And so instead, right, at the end 2024, you have almost all maneuver brigades have a UAS battalion. And then some of these you wanted to make into regiments or brigades, right? And so the idea was you create a structure above the maneuver brigade. And of course, Ukraine lacked the core system it has now. So you had to lack this kind of like something above a brigade. And that they were supposed to increase the size of the kill zone from 10 kilometers beyond the forward line of enemy troops to 15 kilometers, right? Yeah. The problem, though, as you said, is that if you pull from the maneuver brigades for this new formation, well, the maneuver brigades are just weaker. And the maneuver brigades cannot handle the front line themselves as well as they could before. And then the unmanned forces units that are supposed to operate at like 15 kilometers from the front line are actually operating right in front of the battalions because the brigades cannot basically hold the line themselves. And so that was kind of this, the theory and kind of execution didn't work out initially. Of course, it's in a war. There's always a lack of manpower. Everything is scarce. And so you've got to decide where's the best place for these people. I think the theory behind it, it made sense. I think the execution became part of an issue.
Yeah.
But on the Russian side, the same thing applies, right? Where basically the idea with Rubicon is you fund them properly. You have elite guys. They can now hit things further from the front line than a regular brigade can. And when it worked out well, right, you'd have newer brigades maybe, and again, we can talk about the drone line kind of concept Russia came up with, but the Rubicon guys are operating more than 10 kilometers past the front line. New brigade is going to struggle to do that with FPVs typically. And now this new capability means you have better echelon kind of fires that creates problems for Ukraine past the front line. And so we might as well get in the drone line concept, right? So last year, we wrote an article on Substack about this. Last year, different Russian units came up with a response to Ukraine's drone line initiative, and they literally copied the same word, so they called it drone line themselves. And basically, you had 2nd Combined Arms Army and 6th Combined Arms Army both developed their own drone line concept. For 2nd Combined Arms Army, they had like 32 kilometers frontage last summer. They divided up basically into 3 echelons. And they divided up within each echelon, 8 different kind of sectors, right? The first one was from 0 to 5 kilometers past the four-line enemy troops, right, where behind Ukrainian lines. Then that was mostly maneuver brigade FPV teams operating there. 5 to 10 kilometers past the front line, it was mostly Spetsnaz, artillery, reconnaissance units kind of operating there. And then anything beyond 10 kilometers past the front line, it was Rubicon, basically. And this was 2nd Combined Arms Army's concept initially. 6th Combined Arms Army instead had 0 to 5 kilometers. And then the next sector was 5 to 25 kilometers, which is probably too big, but that's what they went with. And the last one was like 25 to 35 kilometers past the front line. And they divvied up a certain number of UAVs and type of UAVs for each sector, right? So Orlan, Lancet for like 25 plus, and other kind of UAVs for closer ranges. And then Center Group of Forces, after 2nd Combined Arms Army tried this in early summer, so the whole group of forces scaled this too. I think they're actually still being employed to this extent. And so they adopted the same idea, 0 to 5, 5, 10 and beyond, except that for more than 10 kilometers past the front line, it was Rubicon attachments, and then it was the Vega detachments from 3rd and 24th Spetsnaz brigades, right? So the kind of more elite units that can focus further from past the front line. And they had different priority targets at different areas, right? So, certain things you want to hit at 2 kilometers past the front line, certain things at 20 kilometers, so on. So they came up with this last summer. They've been using it since last summer. Is an interesting way of approaching how to echelon and how to kind of employ fires most effectively. We've seen at brigade level kind of how brigades try and do this. So they also have their own sectors with themselves. They try and find their own targets. So it's interesting. It's a very kind of early attempt of how do you employ drones effectively, strike, reconnaissance, and so on. But I think the concept actually was not a bad idea. And I I talked to some people from 10th Corps who were facing 6th Combined Arms Army, who thought Russia's employment drones was quite effective. But I think it's worth putting key in mind in Kupiansk, right? Russian army got pushed back there. The drone line initiative did not succeed, obviously.
Not at all.
And you had opportunities where Code 9.2 kind of achieved a kind of dominant position with drones, and so the Russian concept did not was not able to kind of overwhelm that. And then with Center Group of Forces, right, they had responsibility for Pokrovsk, as well as Dobropillia, that whole sector. This was a real priority last fall. And Russia did not achieve a breakthrough, right? And so even though they had this new kind of concept, when Ukraine deployed many of their best drone units there too, they reinforced it, they were able to hold and kind of, push back in some directions.
So thank you for listening to this episode of the Ukraine Military History Podcast. I promised you at the beginning that I'd tell you more about our sponsors. If you'd like to find a way to support the Ukraine Military History Podcast, the Borderlands Foundation more broadly, or if you'd like to work with myself and the contributors, the editors, and the guests that come on this show. So this podcast is produced by the Borderlands Foundation. The Borderlands Foundation has two main initiatives. Our mission at the Borderlands Foundation, it was founded right after the war started in 2022, is to make sure that Ukraine's heroes are never forgotten. And there's two things that I'm passionate about helping Ukraine do. Number one is build a strong future for Ukraine, for my family that I'm raising here in Ukraine, through national military history study and education. I believe that great nations are founded and sustained and grow in strength based on the stories that those nations believe together about their history. And Ukraine has had a very complicated history. It's a very old country. A lot of people don't understand that Ukraine's 500 years older than actually Russia, as Ukraine was around before Russia. Ukraine was founded by Vikings that moved to this part of the world in the 8th and 9th century and were traders and became rulers of the local Slavic people. So Ukraine, Kievan Rus, was an ancient and the most powerful empire in Europe. And Ukraine's history is very controversial. Through the years, Russia has appropriated it, stolen it, called it their own, and then tried to change Ukrainian history to make it their own, this great rich heritage that Ukraine has. So our mission at the Ukraine Military History Institute is go back through history and reclaim Ukraine's great military history tradition, because Ukraine's military history tradition encompasses almost all the great military traditions in the world. It started out interfacing and competing with the Vikings as well as Constantinople, absorbed those traditions over the years. It became part of the Russian military history tradition, the great Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then the Ottoman, Mongol, kind of Crimean Tatar heritage of Genghis Khan's great military tradition, all fused, competed, and created this unique military history tradition inside Ukraine, which I call the Ukrainian Cossack military history tradition, which takes from Western military history, the German, English, American Mission Command, NATO Mission Command School, as well as the good things, hopefully, and leaves the bad from the Russian school, deep battle, and a lot of the positive things that have come out of the Russian military history tradition. And our mission is to help with the world's best military history center studying the current war, going all the way back into history throughout Ukraine's history, starting battles from World War II that were fought in Ukraine, World War I, the first Ukrainian independence period from 1917 through the Russian Civil War in 1921, back to the Cossack period, all the way back. Ukraine has a great and unique style of fighting and tradition of fighting. The first written constitution was written by a Ukrainian Cossack class. The warrior class wrote down the first Declaration of Rights in history, in modern history, which founded the Enlightenment, led to the American Declaration of Bill of Rights, the Polish Constitution, and a number of other declarations of rights and constitutions since then were all inspired first by Ukraine's Declaration of the Rights with Pep Orlok after the defeat at Poltava at the hands of Peter the Great. So understanding Ukraine's military history tradition is a passion of ours. And every author who comes on this episode, who publishes a written work, we're actually paying those authors. So if you want to donate to support the authors, you can donate to get access to anything that's been published in the Ukraine Military History membership site, which we're going to be releasing soon, where people who write about the current war or things from the past in Ukrainian military history, or some military historical case study that can help Ukraine think about how to fight and win and innovate in the current war, all those authors are getting paid by the center. I want to encourage great scholarship by paying Ukrainians to write their own history, and other people want to contribute to pay them to build this body of work and knowledge at the Ukraine Military History Institute. So when you donate to support this podcast, we have production costs. It helps us pay the author that we come on and interview about what they've written or what they've done, and then also just pays for all the production costs, the social media, the distribution, and everything that you enjoy about this podcast. So that's the first way you can support the center. The second big way you can support the center is we have and are building a Heroes of Ukraine tour, which is going to be a custom program that we're developing, which takes people who want to come in and see the battlefields of Ukraine from the current war that have been liberated. We can take you to different battlefield sites. The Battle of Kiev, which we've studied very well and have a lot of material, people who've studied that and can show that to you. Or if you want to go out to other sites, battles that have in territory that's been liberated in Kherson or Zaporizhia, or other places out in Sumy or Kharkiv province, we can take you around to those sites. This is something we're developing. We want to launch this if and when the full-scale fighting with Russia pauses. We believe this could be a much bigger tour that people can come on a tour just buying individual seats, and over a couple of weeks meet people from all over the world who want to see Ukraine. But before we do that public version of the tour where anyone can book any number of seats at scheduled times, if any of you would like to have a tour of the battlefields of Ukraine that have already been liberated and are safe, we don't do war tourism to active parts of the fighting, but we do tours, historical staff ride battlefield tours for military professionals, government officials, and or business leaders that would like to understand what has happened here. You can contact us about the Heroes of Ukraine tour. So that's the Ukraine Military History Institute, which pays for and produces this podcast. The next sponsor I'd like to discuss is the Ukraine Center for Traumatic Stress. This is a center that is near and dear to my heart because of my past service in combat as a soldier, my study of history and the history of psychological trauma that comes from serving in combat, personal experience of my own, overcoming my own struggles with it, is a center dedicated to helping advance the research conversation and funding of breakthrough technologies and treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder, which affects a number of soldiers who've served in Ukraine. And we want to make sure that they recover psychologically to become productive, vibrant leaders in the future of Ukraine. This is headed by Major General Vladislav Klochkov, retired, the former commander, the first commander of the Moral Psychological Support Forces of Ukraine under the Commander-in-Chief, President Valery Zaluzhny. It was a new position that he created right before the full-scale invasion. And General Klochkov has written his PhD on military psychology of a soldier, and is passionate about advancing the study and the treatment of this disorder for Ukrainian veterans. This is a podcast that we're going to be releasing very soon in Ukrainian, translated into English for those who are not Ukrainian that want to listen in on the conversation and comment on it on our social media. But the interviews will be conducted in Ukrainian to advance and start the conversation for Ukrainian veterans, mental health professionals, and government officials who are working on this problem, which we believe is critical to solve for the future of Ukraine. So if you'd like to donate to support that podcast, to help us produce and start that conversation, or if you'd like to inquire about donating to supporting specific veterans going through different treatments, workshops for treatment of PTSD, you're welcome to reach out to us. The center also has a rehabilitation through golf program where we pay for Ukrainian veterans to play golf and go play in our annual Heroes of Ukraine Freedom Summit Golf Tournament, which will be held next year in Dallas in the United States in March. And this is a very important program that you can also take a look at sponsoring veterans in their journey to mental health recovery. So that's the Ukraine Center for Traumatic Stress. And then finally, For those of you who watch this podcast, that you see our co-hosts, some of the guests that come on there, all of our podcasts are filmed in Ukraine. The reason we do this is I believe in talking to Ukrainians and people who will actually come to Ukraine that want to speak about Ukrainian military history, analysis of the current war, defense industry issues, all the things that we need to learn in Ukraine and our allies and NATO who've supported Ukraine to fight and win the next war against our adversaries, Russia, China, Iran. All of the people that support Vladimir Putin are learning from this war the lessons that Russia's learning. We need to make sure that we learn the lessons from the war that Ukrainians are learning better and implement those across the force for our partner forces, Americans, British, all the other European NATO forces, partners out east, Japan, South Korea, Australia, all the countries that are supporting Ukraine. We want to make sure that we create a community that disseminates those lessons. And we get contacted by different groups, sometimes governments, foreign militaries that would like advisory services to help them learn and implement the lessons of this war for their armed forces. Defense companies would reach out and would like to get help developing, testing their product, selling their product inside Ukraine that may be helpful on the battlefield. That's what the Borderlands Group does. We advise defense tech companies. We even do forward support engineering for defense tech companies, software development, hardware, hiring and staffing, forward deployed engineering shop for Western defense companies. So all those services, if you're looking for advisory services, custom analytical studies by Rob Lee and his team, defense advisory services for defense companies or foreign militaries, we can put together a package for you, give you a proposal, and help you with that. So to get in touch with us, just go to the website for theborderlandsgroup.com, fill out our contact us form. We'll evaluate your request and get back to you in the appropriate secure communication channel if that's what you'd like to do. So thank you for watching the sponsor reads here. It's important to me that we provide value to you in every podcast episode, and these are the ways that you can support us so we can continue to afford to produce and expand and increase the frequency of our content production for the benefit of Ukraine and its allies fighting this war, winning this war, and the next.